That's to undergo a background check. That's part of the customs process before you get activated. It's mostly the individuals who can access or control the inventory system.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Lilo, we're back for another show for today, and I'm excited for what we're going to be getting to talk about. But I will say we're at that point in the year where weather's kind of weird, and it's changing seasons and different things. And there's some places that it gets hot, and other places still having winter storms. So I don't know how have you been down in Texas?
Well, it's also back and forth. I mean, at first we were nice and warm, and all of a sudden this last week or so has been a little chilly and heading back to the warm weather. So thank goodness, but we'll see how that pans out, because can't wait to get back to normal weather, because it's going back and forth and changing your wardrobes. Like, okay, now I can go to warmer weather wardrobe.
Short sleeves or something.
Yeah, exactly. Now it gets cold again.
Yeah, I was like literally about 3 days ago. It was like in the, for here in Memphis, it was like in the 30s or something, which is frigid for us. And today it's like almost 80 degrees. So here you go figure. We have some things that talking about that gets into more of your supply chain, but a niche in this. And we're going to be talking about, bulk shipping to, piecemeal type shipping, all kinds of things. They get into all kinds of fun distribution type challenges, but more specifically in this, foreign trade zones. Have you ever dealt with FTZs there?
We have. I mean, and I was remembering in my past life, I've had two lives, one dealing with software in international trade. And the second life, which I'm in right now, is education in international trade. But in the first part of my career, that's all we did is wrote, developed, supported, et cetera, software products for international trade. And one of them happened to be a foreign trade zone product. We had others like for NAFTA back in the day, and of course a GSP and for the maquila industry, or IMEX. Back then it was maquila. But anyway, and yeah, foreign trade zones were very interesting. We had clients that had all kinds of stuff, electronics, automotive, et cetera, that would bring products in into the foreign trade zone to take advantage of that program, and so it was, although a lot of people used to call them free trade zones, but I know it's definitely not a free trade zone. It's a foreign trade zone. So let's end that confusion right now. But I'm thinking our guest will better explain that, so I know he's a very good friend of yours. I mean, personal good friend of yours.
He is fantastic. Listen, folks, we got somebody that is a great friend. He's ugly as Salzer kind of a thing, but he is such a great guy. Now, seriously, Jeremy Page, folks, is with Page Fura. And I got to tell you, it's like Jeremy is such a great guy. He's got a wonderful family. He married up with Shannon with a fantastic wife. All that to say, this is one of the folks that if you have questions, challenges, problems with an FTZ from a legal perspective, setting them up, doing whatever, this is one of the folks you definitely need to look at. So we're going to have his contact information there. But Jeremy, welcome to our show, to Simply Trade, buddy.
Thank you from one ugly professional to another. I appreciate it.
All of this guy. Jeremy, one of the questions I've got for you is we're going through, let's, just right off the bat, a lot of people used to or have mistakenly called them free trade zones versus foreign trade zone kind of thing. What is it, free or foreign?
Here, most of the world, it's a free zone. Here, it's a foreign trade zone, and that's just what we've always called it. It has some different implications, but you're right. I mean, Lala said earlier, so many people want to just use the term free zones, free trade zones. Sorry, I'm a little froggy, so I'm working through. Lost my voice. Not from yelling at Andy, not yet.
Yeah.
But yes, it is a foreign trade zone in the United States, or FTZ, as most people default to.
Well, and I think there is also a difference there's actually what's called a free zone, which we won't go really too much into that, other than that is bigger than just a foreign trade zone or an FTZ building under one company or whatever. A free zone's like a whole area, and we can get into that on something else. But we're going to be talking about FTZs, more specifically an FTZ type operation here in the States. So with that, what is an FTZ? What is like, how do you want to go with this, buddy?
Yeah, well, so a foreign trade zone is physically in the United States, but it's technically outside of the customs territory in that you can bring merchandise in bond. So it's always in a bonded status, and you could avoid, defer, delay, maybe never pay duties and fees on the merchandise processing fees on the merchandise that's stored in there, unless and until you remove it. There are two different categories. There's distribution and manufacturing. So you can manufacture in a zone, withdraw it as a finished product. You can also re-export. You can use it as a place to stage inventory for the future. You can use it as a place to bring in merchandise for relabeling or marking, as a way station until issues are resolved. The hot topic UFLPA, zones are being used in some capacity to hold goods until it's resolved and whether or not there are any issues to be concerned with. So it really has unlimited applications as long as you follow the rules.
Fantastic. Well, one of the things that has been a positive, let's talk about a few scenarios where an FTZ would be applicable into the supply chain of a company. So one of the things that's coming to mind, and I'll let you elaborate here, is where a company let's say they have a factory, I don't know, let's say Italy for some, it's like they're manufacturing a whole bunch of shoes in a design or whatever. Here they all come into the U.S. They come into an FTZ. Of this, let's say it's 100,000 units, and 25% of those units are going to be sold in other countries outside the U.S., but 75% for the U.S. domestic market. Would that be a good application for an FTZ?
Sure, you're making me do some math, but yeah, definitely. It's without a doubt. And, the history of the Foreign Trade Zone program was really an export platform. So, it was created in 1934 under the law of the Foreign Trade Zone Act 1934, and it was really export. And it was really intended heavily also for manufacturing to encourage, think about the time, post-depression. It's a way to encourage opportunities for growth and income, obviously jobs, economic development. So that was really the genesis of the program. And so distribution became more important later, but it was really manufacturing in the early years. But certainly there are many companies, you look at, just like you can see bonded warehouses, which are a poor stepchild in my mind of a foreign trade zone. But, they serve in that capacity a lot of the same functionality. The nice thing about a zone is you have more flexibility with some of your inventory. Bonded warehouses are very lot specific. The lot moves together. Foreign trade zones, you have fungibility, commercial interchangeability with inventory management. So it gives you a little more freedom for how you retain inventory, how you track it, how you decrement it, how you move it in and out. But yes, certainly a zone, that is one of the major ways that it's used as a both domestic distribution and an export distribution platform.
Fantastic. All right. So let's talk about a little bit of the manufacturing side. So with what you're talking about is establishing a factory within an FTZ. You bring in your raw goods, you assemble or manufacture a product, and when it comes out, it's a finished product. In that scenario, then again, is as it's coming out, why would you want to have a factory under a bonded facility to bring that out? And I mean, why would you not just pay duties and taxes on all your raw goods and throw it into a domestic factory and then ship it back out?
I forgot how independently wealthy you are and like to give away money. So thank you for reminding me. So, I mean, there are a couple ways to look at it. You could have a greenfield operation where a company's establishing a new manufacturing footprint and they look at a foreign trade zone being integrated. But you can also take existing operations and they could be converted into a foreign trade zone. So, I mean, there's different reasons. I mean, one, and there's some nuances to it. So it's not a simple answer. Part of it depends upon what is your distribution plan, right? Domestic only, North American, you're going to go out into the wider world. And there are different considerations that come into play for the three of those. Also, what am I making? And I look at my inputs. One of the main benefits to a foreign trade zone, and to your point about paying duty, is that there's something called the inverted tariff. So that in a foreign trade zone, I can bring all my inputs in. There is an array of duty rates that apply, and I don't have to pay them at that time because I come in bond. I identify what's called an emission. I identify the components I'm bringing in. I have to have a robust inventory control system, what they call the ICRS, which is a dedicated system of record. It's not your ERP system. It may communicate with your ERP. It may bolt onto it as a separate module, but it's really a specific platform because it has to speak customs. So it has to communicate back and forth with customs through ACE, and they have integrated. There's still some functionality they could add, but it's mostly been integrated into ACE now. So if I have foreign inputs and I bring it in and I'm making a finished good, I can look at my duty rates that apply to my inputs to my finished product, and I can sort of play the game. And the game is that when I bring out that finished product, I know what the duty rate is that's assessed to that product. And my inputs, I have two options. I can either keep them assigned the duty rate that applied to them when they came into the zone, or they can be subsumed into the value and the classification of the finished product. That latter situation is called the inverted tariff. So, if I have some kind of a heavy manufactured good, and let's say it has a 0% rate of duty. So my 0% rate of duty coming out the back end, all my inputs when they come in, I mean, it might also be zero, because some inputs are zero. It just depends on the classification. But anything that has a rate of duty, I'm going to want to transition to the classification of the finished product. Now, there are some exceptions, and I can touch on them really quickly. But that way, to your point, then I'm not paying those duties. Not only that, because I'm bringing out the finished product, I pay MPF on that finished product. And then there are other benefits that cascade from that. There's something called weekly entry. In a zone, you can bring out a merchandise all week long based on a weekly estimate. And then at the end of the week, you make one entry of the total goods withdrawn during that week. So you can reduce the fees you pay, not just obviously MPF because you have one entry you might max out, but also other fees they might incur, brokerage and supporting fees and things like that. Now that's the Foreign Trade Zone Board will tell you, and we tell our clients, the intent of the program is not for you to minimize your MPF. I mean, that's not why they have the program. It's for economic development, job growth. The duty savings and other incentives might exist, but that's not why. I mean, the Foreign Trade Zone program is an extension of the Department of Commerce, which is where the Foreign Trade Zone Board resides, and they're the ones who decide if you can establish a zone. So you can take advantage of that inversion, but you also could go the other way. If my duty rate on my finished product is, say, 2.5%, say I'm producing a motor vehicle, it's 2.5%. I could have inputs above and below that 2.5%. For the ones above, I want to assign what's called non-privileged foreign status, and the value of those and the classification gets absorbed into the vehicle. But if I have duty rates lower, if I have duty free or 0.7% or whatever it might be for component, I can retain the designation of that component under its existing classification or rate of duty. That's called privileged foreign status. And even though it comes out as part of the vehicle, when I make the entry, it's broken out on the entry under its own classification and its own value and its rate of duty.
Let me jump in here for a second, though. As you're going through this, I mean, we've talked about quite a few things. So I want to, for somebody that there's a lot of our audience that they're somewhat new to, the import export compliance, supply chain and all of that, as well as now also I want to say something to executives and business owners and all of that. So let me recap some of what you were saying and see if you agree if I've got this right. Because you know me, I'm dumb as a box of rocks here, buddy. So you're going to have to almost draw me a picture. If I hear you correctly, utilizing an FTZ would allow a company to basically, some of the benefits would be better manage their cash flow, minimize hits to the cash flow, so that if you're bringing in a bulk of goods, you don't have to pay the duties and taxes initially. You're going to pay the transportation to get the goods into the U.S. Okay, fine. But you can minimize your duty and tax outlay initially because you don't have to pay for any of that until you utilize it and you bring it out of the zone. However, if you've got a manufacturer, you still are deferring payment of duties and taxes and or minimizing the amount you're paying until you actually bring the finished goods out of the zone. And those finished goods that are coming out of the zone, provided that they're going into the U.S. commerce. If you bring them out of the zone and you're selling those to a foreign country, so you're doing an export to that foreign country, you don't have to even pay any duties and taxes into the U.S. So if I've got that correctly, it's a way to better manage your inventory, defer your payments, minimize your outlay, and better manage your cash flow. Would that be a good summary of that?
In general, yeah, I think so. Yes, you can one inventory cycle. You can defer your duty payment forever, right? Until such time as you close your zone or you wind down or reduce your allocations or change your mix, right? So you get that one-time benefit as you establish your zone because that first cycle's going to not have duty payment, because you're just going to cycle it through constantly. And yes, you can also avoid duty payment on re-export, except to Canada or Mexico, where there are some limitations because of USMCA and previously under NAFTA, the duty deferral provisions. So there are situations where, most particularly stuff subject to trade remedies like anti-dumping or Section 301 China, 232, where some of the benefits to be realized from manufacturing items subject to those different restrictions are precluded unless it's going other than Canada or Mexico. Going to Canada or Mexico, you have to use this duty deferral mechanism. It's a complicated wrinkle, but it basically forces you to pay duty on those components subject to 301, 232, or ADD, CVD, because you have to designate those components privileged foreign, right? So when it comes out of the zone, if it comes to the domestic consumption, or even if it goes to Canada or Mexico, you have to treat it as if it was withdrawn for domestic consumption. So that's a constraint. And that's a big issue because when a lot of people think about a zone, they think about their North American opportunities first, right? That may be their biggest export markets, right? So they may be just looking at other markets. So it's important to bear in mind that when and one of the things you do with a zone is you do a feasibility study or analysis, sort of an upfront, back of the envelope calculation that includes things like my one-time duty deferral and saving on my cost of money, right? That I'm not paying that out. And things like what percentage of my goods are exported. And there you have to divide it between export to the rest of the world, although even the U.S.-Chile agreement has the same deferral. None of the other agreements do, or to Canada or Mexico. And we've seen some companies get caught up in that because maybe they went in with the wrong assumption. They thought going anywhere was going to save them the money. And like I said, a lot of times the Canada-Mexico equation is a big proportion of their exports. So it's really critical to understand that there are a lot of opportunities, but because of the specifics of certain laws or the treaty in that case, there are limitations on, from a manufacturing perspective, the benefits you can realize.
Fantastic. All right. So with all the things here, I wanted to do a recap, but I will say that definitely if somebody has heard about FTZs or is, even considering it or say, could we incorporate it? You definitely need to get some experts in here because there's a lot of complexities. It is a niche. It is something that has some big time paybacks, on ROIs, if you will. On the same token, you can make some assumptions and incorrectly, and if you don't do it, set it up right, then you can have problems. But generally, I think I've heard the vast majority of things that it is a very positive for a lot of people on FTZs if you're sourcing a great deal of goods from outside the U.S. and if you're selling to other parts outside the U.S. But that said, who has oversight of an FTZ? I mean, obviously the government's not going to just say, yeah, go ahead and do it. No, I mean, you mentioned customs. Is customs the only thing you have to worry about here?
No, it's a 2-act play. I mean, the Department of Commerce, Foreign Trade Zone Board, that's who you get approval from. So, there's a lot of different players involved in foreign trade zones. So, the law says that every port of entry is entitled to have a foreign trade zone. There are some exceptions where we have like shared ports like Tampa, St. Pete, or Seattle, Tacoma. They have their own, but that's because you have a waterway and there's certain exceptions. But, generally speaking, you could have more than 300 foreign trade zones. There aren't that many, but there are 200, north of 200. And there's variability with how they're used. Some ports are much more active than others, but they have a lot more commercial activity than others. So you can understand why. And the approval actually comes from the Foreign Trade Zone Board as what's first called a general purpose zone, which is either a public or a quasi-public entity. It could be an economic development arm. It could be the city. It could be an airport authority, and they will first get the grant for that general purpose zone, the zone itself, the overall designation from the Foreign Trade Zone Board. From there, individual companies have some options. They could either integrate into the general purpose zone because they may have services they can provide. So maybe they just need warehousing, other distribution support, and it's not worth it for them to invest in their own comprehensive program. So they can take advantage of the GP and the services they can provide. They can develop their own site. There's two ways. You could have a subzone, or you could have what's called a usage-driven site. And those are dedicated to individual users. And all of that also has to go through the Foreign Trade Zone Board. So the grantee supports your request, right? You approach the grantee will support your request. They have the ability to designate land within their jurisdictional framework. And then you go to the Foreign Trade Zone Board, and then they will review. There's an application. There's a form you use. It used to be incredibly cumbersome. You used to submit applications that were inches and inches thick because you had to have all this, it was truly all this economic development explanation, all these maps, all these approvals and things from congressional delegations, all kinds of stuff. And they really streamlined it. Now it's been a number of years. Kudos to the Foreign Trade Zone Board. They really simplified that process. And it's all online applications. It's very transparent. The board is very open to communicate and talking to people. They have no gotcha mentality. They're there for economic development. And so you can submit your application, and if you're just doing distribution, it's a much simpler process because with the Foreign Trade Zone Board, they're less concerned in terms of the items being controlled from a transformative perspective. So that process can take like 30 days, a much more expeditious process. But this is still Act 1. If it's manufacturing, then it could take up 120 days to get all the necessary approvals. And it's much more complicated because you have to provide an explanation of what you're manufacturing, explode your bill of materials to show all the inputs that are going to go in that are foreign inputs. Customs, as I'll talk about more in a second, is a partner at this point as well because you need them to give a letter of concurrence. So there are a lot of little pieces that go into place. And then once you're granted, you get a designation. You get a site designation within the zone itself, and then that lets you complete phase 1. Then we transition to Act 2 or phase 2, which is where customs comes into play. So the day in, day out management and oversight of the zone is customs. Within the port, there are inspectors. Inspectors are generally the interface that you have. So, inspectors have a lot of other responsibilities. That becomes part of it. And so they'll come out, and you have to, once you get the designation, you have to have customs do what they call approve you for activation. So activation is really proving and showing to customs that you have the tools in place to comply with the customs regulations. And those are more particular because this is where the revenue comes into play, right? You're bringing merchandise into the United States.
Revenue for the government you're talking
For the
about
government.
In this case.
Yes.
Yeah,
The big R.
so let's back up for a second. Let me recap. So the first phase is you're basically doing all the bureaucracy, reaching out to the folks. There you go. To the key folks that would be involved to go through a process. So it's there's a lot of different groups locally, at the federal level, regional level, all that. I get that. All right. So you go through all the things, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, putting forward the different justification to say, why do you need an FTZ in this area? There's certain requirements, all that. Okay. Get all that done. I would assume in that.
Hi, everyone. Are you loving our podcast? Do you feel like watching instead of just listening to our episodes? We have started to share our podcast videos on our trade community, www.crowd.trade, where you can view the complete show, comment, and carry conversations with your peers. We have built a trade community around our training courses and different resources for you to collaborate and gain the knowledge you are looking for. Head over to crowd.trade and register for your free account. Let's start trading.
Effort, is that in the phase one? You're also talking about whatever bonds that you may need to be posting. Is that in that phase one, or is that in two?
It's phase two, because you're not in phase one. You're not yet controlling any merchandise.
Okay.
So the bond will become phase two.
All right. So phase one, you do the paperwork, you get the approvals, you get the handshakes, everything's cool. Now you're in phase two, where you've got the actual facility, and you start pulling together. When you're talking about the tools, one of the things, the tools, even Lala was talking about, the systems that are involved and different things of that nature. And you made mention of it. There's some specific inventory management controls that you need to do for an FTZ. You can talk to other systems and inventory and all that, but there are things that are specific to an FTZ that just need to be taken into account, right?
Right. And it's called the Inventory Control and Record Keeping System, or ICRS. And what the regulations really say is, they don't mandate what the system has to look like. They don't mandate that it's automated. They even say it can be automated and or manual. It's just there has to be some oversight. Now today, because of the requirement to interface with ACE, you can't have a manual system. You can't. This isn't like an Excel spreadsheet. You have to have a way to communicate electronically, submit the admissions, the daily admission, which is called the Form 214, and upload that information so that it can get logged in, and it gets uploaded into the ICRS, because that's the communication tool. So the ICRS becomes your inventory layering tool, and it's going to track the movement of everything. The thing about the ICRS that differentiates it from like an SAP ERP is, like I said, it speaks customs. So the tariff classifications, the status, non-privileged foreign, privileged foreign, or domestic, because domestic merchandise, while less concerned, stuff that's already duty paid, you still ostensibly track in the zone, particularly if you have, like, say, dual source goods, some from the U.S., some from overseas. You have to build in inventory layers, and there are rules around inventory layers as well.
Just hold on, just for that. So for our audience, what that means is you can have, now remember, Jeremy mentioned an FTZ is a bonded facility. That means that you have to maintain the sterility of your inventory. It can't be just open access. You just got to be secure, fenced off, and all that. And only restricted employees, not restricted parties. Sorry about that. That means something in customs world, by the way. Yeah, it means that only designated employees that have approval to go into these warehouses and whatnot can do that. You can't just have it open access. Now, that said, with what you just mentioned, you can have foreign-based goods come into the zone, whether it's privileged or non-privileged, but then you can also have domestic freight, so that are inventory, that means that you sourced it from the U.S. or you brought in the goods and went ahead and tendered an entry to clear it into the U.S. commerce. Now it becomes domestic freight, but it can also be in that zone. But here's the key. You've got to have an inventory system to delineate and track all of that. This is this status, it's domestic or it's foreign or whatever, right? All right. So that helps in your inventory. You don't have to have separate warehouses for everything. You put it all in one, but you got to track it.
Right. And unlike a bonded warehouse, it doesn't have to be like a dedicated lot location. You can use your warehousing structure however you want. If you have a WMS that has, row, column, bay, all that stuff, you can do that. You can put merchandise in, one shipment goes here, one shipment goes there. It doesn't have to all be put together. It's just the system has to be robust enough to track it all. And, distribution's obviously easier because, the items coming in, going out. And it could be, and you deem the first items in or the first items out. So the zones either let you use FIFO or FOFI, foreign first. Most people don't find foreign first beneficial. It may be useful when I'm transitioning to domestic source of supply, so I want to get the dutiable goods out, right? So maybe that's where you use FOFI, very specific circumstances, or because of some cost element to relieve inventory. So distribution is pretty manageable. Manufacturing is more complicated because I've got my exploded bill of material, and that's where you're going to see like a bill of material that'll combine privileged foreign, non-privileged foreign, domestic, right? So all of that still gets relief from the inventory, but the part that customs cares about is obviously the privilege and non-privilege, because that's where you haven't paid duty. So while they want you to still have some oversight to domestic, the real obligation to track inventory, to report inventory, to pay your duties obviously is on, or if you're going to export it and be able to export it without any USMCA consequences, is on that foreign source merchandise.
Sounds great. The only way to do that is with a good system and software and a good group of people that will adhere to what they need to do to make sure that system works properly.
Yeah, and I will tell you, that's a lot of people don't understand that. They go in, they do some, again, this back of the envelope calculation, and they forget the cost side. And the cost side has some variability. That first year, particularly if it's manufacturing, it's an investment because, you've got to invest in that software, and, software programs are, it's very difficult to do it homegrown. I know one client who had a guy who developed an internal program, and he used to laugh. He slept under his computer bay. It was his holy grail to get this done. And he created this beautiful system, but for the most part, there are third-party providers people turn to. And, they charge variable depending upon complexity, number of different goods, number of transactions. I mean, it's all pretty much the same that way. But you have a one-time big upfront expense for that software. And then you obviously have ongoing maintenance, annual maintenance fees. You're going to have charges from the grantee because for them to support you, again, their economic development arm. So this is one way that they generate revenue for economic development is by supporting the notion of a zone, but they get fees, annual fees for the application. It just depends on the zone, and that's all public. They have what's called a public tariff. And then there's other things, Andy, you mentioned like the bond. So, before you can go live, just like you have a basic import entry bond, there's a dedicated type 4 bond for foreign trade zones that states you'll comply with your zone obligations. So these are the obligations within the 4 walls, right? To how I will mostly track my inventory, report discrepancies, report out on, deal with admissions and everything happening within the floor and other reporting requirements. So that's your operator bond. So that's critical to have in place. And then you have to move everything in bond, right? So another hidden cost for a lot of people, particularly in the last couple of years when there's been a lot of shortage of available trucks, is you've got to move everything in bond. So that's an increased cost per movement. And it's critical that you do that. There are certain rules around arrival in terms of when you have to admit merchandise from the time of arrival. So you can do some staging, but you've got to be careful that you don't let inventory languish and not be admitted into the zone on a timely basis. So, there are puzzle pieces around that. And then you also mentioned the employees and restrictions. There's a core group of employees that has to undergo a background check. That's part of the customs process before you get activated. It's mostly the individuals who can access or control the inventory system, not the receiving guys, nobody like that. It's really who can get into the system tools and maybe make changes. Those are the ones that the government cares the most about. It used to be in the old days, they wanted to go up to the higher level reports to the directors and stuff, and they've gotten away from that, realizing that it was futility. There was no point. They weren't involved in the zone. So there are a lot of costs you have to consider, and it's really important to bear that in mind, that your payload, what you're going to realize, may be a year off on a horizon, because you've got to get through the Foreign Trade Zone Board and you got to get through the customs process. Now you can overlayer those somewhat. You can start working the customs dialogue, particularly because you need to let them concur in the FTZB application. But there's only so much you can do. One of the things we'll do is we'll ask customs to come out to a site visit early. Obviously, if it's a greenfield, it's a little harder. Sometimes you use drawings or blueprints, or as they're building the facility, you get that general manager out there and they can see right then and there, do we want lights in certain places? Do we want cameras in certain places? How do we access, like in CTPAT? Do we need a cage for drivers or limit their ability to travel the floor? Where's the break room? Where are the bathrooms? And so you start to do that with customs. And if you develop that rapport early, when they come back for the final blessing, hopefully you've got everything all bundled up and they're happy, right? Everything looks good. So you can shorten that time period, but still, like distribution, again, you need that approval as well. You still need to worry about customs. Again, access, ingress, egress, where do you park? Where do the trucks park? Are they different parking lots? How do you control seal removal? All kinds of dynamics, which, one of the reasons why foreign trade zones is kind of a sort of a best practice for CTPAT is because so much of the security protocol layers beautifully with like the CTPAT program. And so, a lot of times if you're in CTPAT and you've done stuff for your domestic locations, it's a lot easier to migrate to a foreign trade zone, because maybe you only have to tweak what you do instead of making a more substantial capital investment to bring your facility in line.
Well, with what you're saying, the one thing I will say is that, again, we've gone through a lot of complexities, a lot of detail, a lot of, you could be what if you don't do it right or whatever. I don't want somebody to get scared of this and go, that is just too laborious, or it's too, onerous or whatever. Folks, most of you would benefit if you're sourcing from foreign sources as far as your goods, your raw goods, or whatever you're doing there. It would be well worth your time and effort to talk to some key experts, and they will be asking you questions such as, what is it you're striving to do? What is your company doing? What are you trying to accomplish as far as your thoughts of just an FTZ, let alone what is your current supply chain? What are you doing with all these things? And it'd be one of those that you step back and it's a strategic decision. But it's one of these areas where you could significantly improve your cycle times and as I mentioned earlier, as we were talking, your cash flows and things of that nature. You can potentially increase your margins on your goods as far as overall profits. Bottom line, that's one of the things that, we're not in this for a charity. We're in this for, you got to make a buck, and the more bucks you make, the more jobs you create, the more situations there. Great. All that to say is what everything in is, Jeremy is going to forget more than I'm going to learn when it comes to these FTZs. With that, I will say it's worth investing in a conversation with somebody like Jeremy. And there's other consultants out there as well that specialize in this and the systems out there and all of that. So I don't want to scare somebody away from an FTZ perspective, but overall, what do you think as far as FTZs? Should they, what would be the normal approach? What should they do to get prepared and say, hey, Jeremy, I'm interested in this, but before they call you, what would you like for them to do?
Yeah. And your point's a good one. I mean, there's a cost to everything, but there's huge benefits to zones. And I think you kind of have to have almost like a 5-year plan. And you need to forecast yourself forward. and think about, where we are today. Where do we think we're going to take the company, right? If maybe we're not heavy in exports today, but we see opportunity in export markets and we want to take advantage of that. I mean, hand in glove, many opportunities, foreign trade zones, or you're going to reshore, and you're going to reshore or for some purpose, even nearshoring at a component level. If you're doing finished products, it might reduce your transport costs to bring across from Mexico or from, further into Central America, wherever you might be looking at, or the Caribbean, whatever you're looking at. So I think it really fits in well with some of the shifts we're seeing in terms of where we're sourcing from as a possibility, because that's also driving, if I'm no longer going to be, and obviously the big boogeyman of the room is China, and I've been using China as a platform to sell into other countries in Asia, right? But I'm looking at, is that realistic for me? And maybe I have some footprint in the U.S. and rather than invest all new in some other country like a Vietnam or Malaysia or whatever, I'm like, I can beef up in the States. And the U.S. is certainly giving you companies incentives, right? Like the CHIPS Acts and other things we're seeing to try to encourage more investment in the U.S. Well, that's something to really think about in integrating a zone, because then you can bring here, use your existing footprint, take advantage of grants and other money that's out there, and then use that as your export footprint to go back out. And I know people would say, well, now I'm shipping it that way. But you're down to one bigger plant that you can control everything and have better oversight and control your own tools, your own equipment. You have the brain trust and know-how. We're seeing controls on know-how on export, and limitations on your ability to share. So there's other dynamics that I think support the idea of integrating a larger manufacturing footprint in the U.S. And I think that's to us, that's the thing. You've got to look at where do you intend to go in X years. And we've had discussions all the time with people where we talk about like the finance people, and they'll bring in their purchasing and their sales, right? Because you really need that whole the whole flow, right?
Well, you're going to need the entire, all your IT, your marketing at some point, your cycle times, your transportation logistics, and
your compliance and knowing bills of material, how they explode. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't have to go to the deep dive, at that initial thing, because now you're getting into really a micro level. But at more conceptually, what markets do you see yourself being in 5 years? In what proportion of your split? The types of commodities. And then use it as sort of a starting point. What's your import volumes of inventory, right? What's your turn? What duties did you pay last year? What are you paying this year?
Are you filing any duty drawbacks right now? That's another key factor in that.
That's exactly right, because you may be recovering a lot of duty today through drawback. And there's a question of, is there time value of money? Do I want to stay with drawback or look at this as an option? Because it is a very different program. So all that has to go into that equation, but I think that's a big part of it. The homework going in is to identify who your customers are today, identify who your customers will be tomorrow, identify your suppliers today and tomorrow, and look for the last maybe 3 years on what have been your costs you've incurred, across the board that you could tie back to imports. And what can we do to maybe reduce that exposure? What can you do, more important than me, to reduce that exposure and that cost? And I think that's the point going in is what's, and you want to be, realistic about it. We always can go for the high end, the low end, hit that middle cut, and then see how the math works out, Like I said, it may be 2 years before you get a payback, 100% payback. But then it's mostly gravy, because your cost is more heavily front end than after that. And then it's more maintenance cost. And that's where we've seen clients, and that's been the reality a lot with manufacturers for sure. Distribution is a different ballgame. So, you still have a cost, but it's not as extreme because you don't have the bills of material to evaluate, things like that. So that recovery can happen much more quickly. But those are the things that I would say you want to have going in, is for that data gathering, that forecasting, where we're going to go next in the world. That's critical to that evaluation.
I think it's important to look at it, having that 5-year plan or going back 3 years in your cost and when all that's good. And again, it may be well worth it to even have reach out to some consultants or some key experts to help your team walk through the process, to ask the questions you may not be thinking about. If you're, the old adage, you're so close to the trees, you can't see the forest, or you can't see the forest for the trees kind of thing because you're too close to them. The point being is FTZs are definitely well worth it, especially if you have any kind of international transactions. And there may be options in there, and there are people that are in this industry that will tell you, no, FTZ is not your answer. But probably 90% of the time of situations I've seen, an FTZ is definitely well worth looking into and possibly employing.
I like to always throw out the resources and the education and, where you're going to learn about this and stuff like that. And lately we've been talking a lot about some different associations that are out there that help out individuals like ICPA, AEI, et cetera. But the one that is very relevant for this industry is the NAFTZ, which I know, Jeremy, you and your wife are very involved in. I don't know if you want to give out a shout out or something on that organization, why they should join and the benefits. And then we'll go into their final thoughts on this topic. But I really feel that there's a lot more that we can dig into this. So we're definitely going to have you and or Shannon back on the show so we can dig in deeper, like a 201, FTZ 201 type show. But I'm wondering if we can wrap up with that.
Sure. So yeah, the NAFTZ, the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, it's been around for, I think, more than 50 years at this point. It's a dedicated association to foreign trade zones, very, very active, very much involved with government engagement. Matter of fact, this past week they had their annual legislative conference in DC, and they had Customs, Commerce, USTR. They have other government agencies that show up as well. They have people from the Hill. They'll come in from the congressional offices, and then they do a day of lobbying when they go on to the Hill to meet with different congressmen and women to discuss issues either pertinent to an individual zone site or location or some of the larger issues we're grappling with right now, like the de minimis issue. And they do a lot of education. Besides the legislative conferences in May this year, they'll be in Tucson, Arizona, like the third week in May. And then in September, I think it's September, or maybe it's October this year, the annual conference is down in Miami Beach. And so then they also, for people who don't know, there's a fundamentals conference that's normally held in January that is like a 2-day boot camp so people can get really acclimated if they're new to the zone program. But it's a great organization. Their membership is very active. It's not a lot of shy people, but it's great. They'll ask questions. They do a lot of webinars as well. If you're interested, it's naftz.org, I think it's the website. But yeah, Shannon is on the board. My partner's on the board, as well as the executive council. So she's the vice chairman this year to the association. And, I'm speaking at the program in May. And it's really well represented by different industries, as well as like government officials and of course, attorneys and consultants. But I highly recommend it. I think it's a great place to learn.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. My goodness, it's always good to catch up with you, but I'm going to tell you, this is phenomenal. And you are just once again, you knock it out of the park. You know your stuff, and appreciate you so much. So you're still ugly, but you're just a good guy.
maybe one thorn fell off the rose. No, I really appreciate you guys having me. It's been really fun. So I look forward to 201, or maybe we'll have Shannon, one of us will come back and do that as well.
There you go. It's like, it'll be great. Lila, with the Global Training Center, do you have some courses involved that would kind of touch on some of the things you would need as far as FTZs?
No, actually, I'm glad that we are talking about FTZs on this episode, because we actually don't have anything that has been on our roster, but we will be adding here pretty soon something that we want to offer. And we may kick it off with something like a free webinar just to get people kind of informed as to what is an FTZ, and then go into a formal program that like our traditional courses. But yes, at this point, if you go and look in our roster, you're not going to find anything other than that we're developing something. So,
All right. Well, Jeremy, again, thank you. Lalo, you have a wonderful day. And for those that are listening, again, thank you so much. Please, please, please do a couple things. One, like our show. When you download it, please, like it and share it. And then tell your friends about us, because we can definitely use more support, but we are trending up, and it's all because of y'all's listening. So we appreciate you.
Right. I have something funny. I heard another podcast, and I'm going to steal this from them. I want to have I guess back in the day, they used to call it a gentleman's agreement. I don't want to be, exclude any females or anybody else on this, but they called it a gentleman's agreement. We're providing you free content. So do us a favor of liking us, sharing us, and following us, and just so that we can continue this free content. And we believe it's really good. I mean, Jeremy just gave us a really good talk here on foreign trade zones, and something that you normally get at a conference that you're going out there and paying for, and so that's just a small example, because I believe everything that we've provided here is conference fee level, so anyway, I just wanted to see if we can have anybody honor that gentleman's agreement and at least follow us and like us and see where we
need the
grow our audience that way. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but Jeremy, we'll add your your contact information, your firm's link and everything on the show notes, what we call our show notes. So we'll go ahead and do that. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, we'll make sure that there's somehow a way to get in touch with you. Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.